On the night of November 28, 1966, a 26-year-old watchman named Dennis Hale finished his shift on the SS Daniel J. Morrell and turned in for the night. It was the last run of the season. Christmas was 3 weeks out, and 33 uneventful crossings of Lake Huron had given him every reason to believe the 34th would be exactly the same. He went to sleep without a second thought, which is the last time in his life he'd ever do that. 8 minutes after the general alarm sounded, Dennis was in 34-degree water, watching a 603-foot ship tear itself in half around him. Not from an explosion, not from a collision, but from the mechanical logic of 3 waves arriving in the wrong sequence at the wrong interval, with no warning and no mercy. 28 men died. Dennis spent the next 38 hours on a life raft with a pea coat, a pair of boxer shorts, and the bodies of 3 crewmates who didn't make it through the night. Why? The wave pattern that likely destroyed the Morrell has a name, the Three Sisters, and it's one of the most dangerous, least understood phenomena on the Great Lakes. 3 rogue waves in rapid succession, each one hitting before the ship can shed the water from the last. Sailors have blamed it for some of the worst maritime disasters in North American history. Scientists only confirmed it was real in 2015. But here's a question worth sitting with. If the Three Sisters simply vanished tomorrow, would the Great Lakes finally become the safe, predictable waterway people have always wanted them to be? Would ships stop sinking? Would families stop waiting? The answer is stranger than you'd expect and a little harder to swallow. Before we get there, had you ever heard of the Three Sisters before this video? Drop a comment below, because we're genuinely curious how many people knew that something this dangerous was hiding inside a word as innocent as lake. This is one wave away. So before we answer what happens if the Three Sisters disappear, we need to understand what they actually are, because 3 big waves is about as useful a description as a really bad day. The phenomenon belongs to a broader category that oceanographers call rogue waves, and the technical definition is precise: a wave whose height exceeds twice the significant wave height of its surrounding sea state. In plain English, imagine the water around you is throwing punches at shoulder level, and then without warning, one comes in over your head. Now imagine 3 of them back to back. Rogue waves were for a long time the maritime equivalent of the Loch Ness Monster. Sailors swore by them. Scientists politely nodded and changed the subject. That changed in 1995 when instruments on an oil platform in the North Sea recorded a single wave of 84 feet appearing out of nowhere in conditions that should have produced nothing over 40. After that, the models had to be rewritten, and researchers began looking more carefully at places where the conditions for rogue waves weren't just possible, they were essentially built in. Places like the Great Lakes. Here's what makes the Great Lakes and Lake Superior, in particular, such a productive breeding ground for this kind of wave. It starts with something called fetch, the unobstructed distance over which wind can travel across open water, building energy as it goes. On Lake Superior, fetch can exceed 300 miles in certain wind directions, enough to generate waves that in terms of raw energy rival anything on the open ocean, but compressed into a much smaller space with much shorter intervals between crests. Then there are the shorelines. Unlike sandy beaches, which absorb wave energy, the Great Lakes are lined in many places with near-vertical rock faces, the sandstone bluffs of the Apostle Islands being a prime example. When a wave hits one of those walls, it doesn't dissipate. It bounces back, traveling in the opposite direction, and when that reflected wave meets an incoming one, their energies combine. Under the right conditions, a wave that was already large becomes something considerably worse. And this is where the Three Sisters specifically come in. The mechanism is almost insultingly straightforward once you understand it, and absolutely lethal in practice. The first wave crests over the ship's deck, flooding it with water. Before the vessel has any chance to shed that weight and rise back to a stable position, the second wave arrives. And before it can recover from that, the third one hits, stacking on top of the accumulated backwash from both previous waves, overloading the deck with a volume of water the hull was never designed to carry. What makes this particularly nasty is the timing. On the open ocean, the period between wave crests, the time a ship has to recover, can be 15 to 20 seconds or more. On the Great Lakes, because the water is shallower and the fetch shorter, that window can collapse to 8 or 9 seconds. A 600-foot ore carrier is not something you maneuver quickly, and 8 seconds is not enough time for physics to work in your favor. The lake, in this sense, doesn't fight fair. Yesterday. For decades, this was all considered more legend than science, the kind of story that lived in dockside bars and shipping company folklore. That changed in 2015 when Professor Chin Wu and researcher Josh Anderson at the University of Wisconsin-Madison deployed wave measuring instruments throughout the Apostle Islands and confirmed it. Rogue waves on Lake Superior were real. They clustered together under specific conditions, and they were most likely to appear near exactly the kind of reflective rock walls the lakeshore is famous for. The most chilling piece of evidence, though, didn't come from a lab. It came from a captain who was there. On the evening of November 10, 1975, Captain Jesse Bernie Cooper of the Arthur M. Anderson, the vessel sailing closest to the Edmund Fitzgerald, reported that his ship was struck by 2 waves between 30 and 35 feet tall in rapid succession. The first buried his rear cabin deck. The second put water across the bridge, the elevated wheelhouse, tens of feet above the waterline. Cooper watched those waves continue northeast directly toward the Edmund Fitzgerald and estimated they would have reached her within minutes. The Fitzgerald, which Captain McSorley had already reported was listing, had damaged vents and was taking on water, never sent a distress signal. She disappeared from radar at 7:10 p.m., taking all 29 crew members with her. Whether it was the Three Sisters that finished her or something else entirely is a question that Lake Superior has never answered. It tends not to. Now that we understand what the Three Sisters are and how they work, it's worth stepping back through history, because the Great Lakes didn't just produce one catastrophe that fits this pattern. They produced dozens, but 3 of them stand apart, each one illustrating a different way the same mechanism can destroy a ship, a crew, and in one case, an entire fleet in a single night. We've already met Dennis Hale in the opening of this story, but the full account of what happened to the Daniel J. Morrell deserves more than an introduction. The ship was 60 years old in 1966, built in 1906, back when she was the longest vessel on the Great Lakes, and earned the nickname Queen of the Lakes. By November of 1966, she was on her 34th and final trip of the season, running in ballast, meaning empty, riding high in the water toward Taconite Harbor, Minnesota, to pick up a load of iron ore. Running empty on a ship that size is its own kind of problem. A fully loaded ore carrier sits low and stable, her weight pressing down through the water like an anchor. Empty, she rides high and stiff, which means every wave that hits doesn't roll beneath her. It slams into her broadside with full force. And on the night of November 28th, the waves on Lake Huron were reaching 30 feet, driven by 65-mile-per-hour winds that had been building for hours across hundreds of miles of open water. At 2 in the morning, the hull gave way, not in one clean break, but in a slow, grinding tear that Dennis Hale described as sounding like paper ripping, accompanied by sparks visible in the dark. The stern section, still under engine power lights, still on, continued moving on its own for nearly 90 minutes after separating, eventually sinking several miles from the bow. The clock recovered from the stern was stopped at 3:28 a.m., which means the back half of the ship traveled alone through a November gale for an hour and a half before it finally went under. Like, 4 men made it onto a life raft. By the time a Coast Guard helicopter found them the following afternoon, 38 hours later, 3 of them were dead, one by one, from hypothermia, the last one dying with his arm around Dennis Hale. Dennis was so far gone that when he waved at the helicopter, the rescuer later said the wave was so faint he thought it might have been caused by the rotor wash. They cut off his life jacket at the hospital and administered last rites. He was 26 years old. Emptal. 9 years later, and one lake to the west, a ship nearly 4 times the size of the Morel would disappear in far less time and with far less warning. The SS Edmund Fitzgerald was 729 feet long, loaded with 26,000 tons of iron ore pellets, and widely regarded as one of the most capable vessels on the Great Lakes. On November 10, 1975, she was making a routine late-season crossing of Lake Superior when a storm began building that the weather forecasts had badly underestimated. By late afternoon, Captain Ernest McSorley was already reporting trouble. A fence rail damaged 2 vents, broken the ship, taking on water and developing a list. He was talking to Captain Jesse Bernie Cooper on the Arthur M. Anderson, the nearest vessel, as conditions deteriorated. At 7:10 p.m., Cooper's radar operator noticed the Fitzgerald had vanished from the screen. There was no distress call, no mayday, no final transmission. She was simply there, and then she wasn't. What Cooper had reported earlier that evening was significant. His own ship had been struck by 2 massive waves, 30 to 35 feet in rapid succession, the first burying the rear deck, the second washing over the bridge. He watched those waves continue northeast, directly toward the Fitzgerald. Official investigations pointed to flooding through damaged hatches as the likely cause. But the wreck itself told a more violent story, found in 2 pieces 170 feet apart at 530 feet below the surface, with the bow section buried nose first into the lake bed. All 29 crew members were lost. No bodies were ever recovered from the deep water. Every November 10th, the Mariners' Church in Detroit rings its bell 29 times, once for each man, a tradition that has continued without interruption for 50 years. Gordon Lightfoot's song about the disaster became one of the best-known ballads in North American music, which means the Fitzgerald is probably the most famous shipwreck most people couldn't point to on a map. But if the Fitzgerald is the most famous, the storm of 1913 was the most catastrophic, and it remains to this day the single worst disaster in the recorded history of the Great Lakes. It came to be called the White Hurricane, which is one of those names that manages to sound both poetic and completely accurate, at the same time a convergence of 2 massive storm systems that produced hurricane-force winds, whiteout snow squalls, and waves estimated at 35 feet on Lake Huron alone. In a 16-hour window on the night of November 9th into the morning of the 10th, 8 ships went down on Lake Huron alone, taking 187 people with them. Across all 5 lakes, the final toll was 12 ships lost, more than 250 dead, and dozens more vessels damaged or run aground. What made it particularly devastating was the wave period. Modern simulations have confirmed the crests were arriving every 10 seconds, which meant that on a large ore carrier, there was simply no time between impacts to recover, drain, or stabilize. So now we get to the question, the one worth asking out loud, even if the answer makes you uncomfortable. We've just walked through what the three sisters have done to ships, to crews, to entire towns that sent their men out in November and never got them back. So let's try running history the other way. What if this phenomenon had never existed? What if the specific chain reaction, first wave, second wave, third wave, no recovery time, had simply never been a feature of the Great Lakes? Let's start with the night. We already know November 28, 1966, and a 26-year-old watchman named Dennis Hale, who went to bed on the Daniel J. Morrell without a second thought. The ship was 2 days out from Taconite Harbor. The crew was already mentally halfway home for Christmas, and some of them, documented fact, had already bought gifts. They were the last run of the season, running light, riding high in the water, and November was doing what November does on Lake Huron. Without the three sisters, the storm still happens. The 65-mile-per-hour winds still happen. The 30-foot waves still happen. But the critical mechanism, the second wave arriving before the ship can shed the first, and the third arriving to stack on top of both, doesn't. The hull of the Morrell, already stressed by 60 years of Great Lakes winters, gets pushed hard. It flexes, it groans, but it doesn't cross the threshold into fracture, because that threshold requires a specific sequential overload that the physics simply never delivers. The Morrell makes it to Taconite Harbor. All 29 crew members go home. Dennis Hale is not the sole survivor of anything. He's just a 26-year-old watchman from Ohio who had a rough crossing and a good story to tell over Christmas dinner. There is no book called Shipwrecked Reflections of the Sole Survivor. There are no 20 years of silence from a man too traumatized to speak. There is no bell-ringing ceremony at a museum in 2016 where each of 28 names gets its own toll. There are just 29 people who went to work and came back, which is how it was supposed to go. Now take that same logic 9 years forward to Lake Superior, November 1975. The Edmund Fitzgerald is already in trouble before the waves even become the main issue. Captain McSorley has reported damaged vents, a developing list water coming in. Those problems exist with or without the three sisters. But a ship that is listing and taking on water can still be a ship that limps into port given enough time and given waves that arrive in a manageable sequence. What it cannot survive is three 35-foot walls of water hitting it in rapid succession when it's already compromised. Without that sequence, the Fitzgerald might still have sunk that night. We can't know for certain. But the question of whether she would have is almost beside the point, because the larger consequence is cultural. Gordon Lightfoot never writes "The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald," the song that put Lake Superior shipwrecks on the radio, in living rooms, in the consciousness of millions of Americans who had never set foot near a Great Lake and had no particular reason to fear one. That matters more than it sounds. Awareness of risk changes behavior on the water. It changes what captains decide to do in marginal weather, what shipping companies allow, what the Coast Guard prioritizes. The Fitzgerald disaster and the song that followed it put pressure on regulators in ways that quieter tragedies never had. Without that cultural moment, the institutional response is slower, softer, less urgent. And here is the first paradox of a world without the three sisters. Fewer dramatic sinkings does not automatically mean fewer deaths. It might just mean the deaths are quieter, more spread out, and easier to ignore. The engineering consequences run even deeper. In November 1958, 7 years before the Morrell, 17 before the Fitzgerald, the SS Carl D. Bradley broke apart in northern Lake Michigan, taking 33 of her 35 crew with her. 2 men survived, Frank Mays and Elmer Fleming, clinging to a raft through the night, while the temperature of the water around them sat at 36 degrees. Both later recalled hearing the rivets popping from the hull before the ship finally gave way. The Bradley disaster, combined with the Morel 8 years later, forced a reckoning in the shipbuilding industry. Investigators identified that the steel used in pre-1948 vessels had properties that made it brittle in cold water, prone to sudden fracture under the kind of twisting sequential stress that rogue wave patterns create. Hull design standards changed. Structural reinforcement at stress points became mandatory. Wave loading calculations were revised to account for conditions specific to the Great Lakes, including implicitly the possibility of multiple large waves in rapid succession. Now remove those disasters from history. Without them, the engineering lessons don't get learned, or they get learned later after more deaths from a different and probably less visible failure mode. Ships get built to thinner tolerances. Hulls get approved that shouldn't be. The industry optimizes for speed and cost against a threat profile that in this alternate timeline has never truly announced itself. And when a bad enough conventional storm finally comes through, not Three Sisters, just a sustained gale with nothing particularly exotic about it, those thinner ships go down just the same. We just don't have a song about it. But the consequences of losing the Three Sisters don't stop at shipwrecks and engineering codes. Some of them are quieter. Some of them are written into the landscape itself, carved literally into stone. The Apostle Islands on the southwestern shore of Lake Superior are one of the most visually striking places in the entire Great Lakes region. A cluster of 22 islands with sea caves cut deep into red sandstone cliffs. Their walls sculpted into arches and columns and cathedral-like chambers that draw hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. Massenet. In winter, when the lake surface freezes and ice formations build up inside the caves, stalactites of blue and white hanging from ceilings of ancient rock, it becomes something that looks less like a place on Earth and more like the inside of a fever dream. The National Park Service estimates that in exceptional ice years, up to 100,000 people make the walk across the frozen lake to see it. None of them are thinking about wave mechanics. But wave mechanics is exactly what made it. Those caves took thousands of years to form. Thousands of years of large waves, including the largest hitting sandstone at speed, exploiting cracks, widening them, carving chambers one storm at a time. Without the Three Sisters contributing their particular force and frequency to that process, the Apostle Islands look different. Fewer caves, shallower formations, less dramatic cliff faces. And it's not just the Apostle Islands. Every bay, every headland, every island along the entire Great Lakes shoreline was shaped by the same forces that sailors have spent centuries trying to survive. The enemy built the scenery. That's worth sitting with for a moment. The thing that has killed hundreds of sailors and broken some of the strongest ships ever built on freshwater is also the thing responsible for one of the most visited natural landmarks in the American Midwest. Remove it, and you don't just make the lake safer. You make it smaller in a way that has nothing to do with its dimensions. Then there is the consequence that nobody sees coming, and that in the long run may be the most significant of all. The Three Sisters are not only a surface phenomenon. When a wave of that magnitude strikes not rolling, but impacting, driving its full mass downward, it generates a pressure column that propagates through the water column beneath it. That force reaches the deeper layers of the lake, disturbing the thermal stratification and pushing cold, nutrient-rich water from the bottom upward toward the surface. The process is called upwelling, and it underpins the entire food web of the Great Lakes. But upwelling feeds phytoplankton. Phytoplankton feeds zooplankton. Zooplankton feeds juvenile fish. Juvenile fish feed larger fish. Larger fish feed bald eagles, bears, and the 40 million people who depend on the Great Lakes for drinking water and food. It is one of those chains where if you pull any link out of sequence, everything above it starts to wobble, and the link that Three Sisters helps maintain sits right at the bottom, in cold, dark water, invisible and largely unthanked. Without that, wave-driven mixing thermal stratification strengthens. The lake divides more firmly into layers, warm on top, cold below, and the barrier between them becomes harder to cross. Oxygen-depleted dead zones expand in the deeper water. The lake whitefish, which has been commercially fished by Ojibwe communities for thousands of years and remains one of the most economically important species in the region, loses the cold, oxygenated habitat it needs to spawn and survive. And this decline doesn't announce itself with a shipwreck or a headline. It announces itself in nets. Year after year, a fisherman pulls his gear and finds it a little lighter than the year before, then lighter still. There's no single moment of catastrophe, no dramatic loss to point to, just a slow, accumulating absence that takes years to name and decades to reverse, if it can be reversed at all. The lake doesn't look any different from the surface. That's the problem. The damage is deep and quiet, and by the time anyone connects it to something as seemingly unrelated as the absence of certain wave patterns, the window for action has already been open for a very long time. Now add one more layer, the one that connects the Three Sisters to the weather in cities that have never seen the lake. In October and November, when these waves are most active, they do something beyond just threatening ships. They churn the surface layer of the lake, accelerating heat loss and cooling the water faster than it would cool on its own. That faster cooling is one of the triggers for lake effect snow, the hyper-localized, sometimes absurdly intense snowfall that hammers communities downwind of the lakes every winter. Buffalo, Cleveland, Syracuse. These cities have entire cultural identities built around their winters, and those winters are partly a product of wave activity on the lakes in autumn. Without the Three Sisters, the lake holds its heat longer into the season. Lake effect snow arrives later, hits less hard. And here is where it gets interesting. The agriculture of the entire Great Lakes region has been calibrated over generations to that specific seasonal rhythm. Michigan apples, Wisconsin cherries, New York wine grapes. All of them depend on a frost calendar that was set in part by how quickly the lakes cool in autumn. Tarshem. Shift that calendar and you shift everything downstream from it. Earlier springs mean earlier blooms, which means earlier exposure to late frosts that can wipe out a crop entirely. Later snowfalls mean different soil conditions, different planting windows, different yields. The farmers making these decisions don't think about rogue wave physics. Why would they? But the physics is there in the background, quietly setting the table, and a world without Three Sisters means a world where that table is set slightly differently for every growing season indefinitely. Inafta. And finally, the consequence that resists being measured at all. The Ojibwe people have lived alongside these lakes for thousands of years before the first European map drew a line around them, and their relationship with Lake Superior, which they called Gitche Gume, meaning Great Sea, was never the relationship of a user to a resource. The lake was an entity. It had will. It could give and it could take, and it remembered what you did on its water. The waves that arrive in threes were not given a clinical designation by the people who first named them. They were called sisters, a word that implies relationship, intention, personality. Not a weather event, not a fluid dynamics anomaly. Sisters. Something that moves together, that coordinates, that comes for you in a way that feels, if you are on the receiving end of it, like something more than coincidence. Sailors who spent their careers on these lakes understood intuitively what took physicists until 2015 to confirm in a laboratory. There is a saying among Great Lakes mariners that every sailor knows and nobody likes to repeat too often. Lake Superior never gives up her dead. The water is cold enough, deep enough, and still enough in places that bodies do not decompose and rise the way they do in warmer water. 28 men from the Morel, 29 from the Fitzgerald, most of them are still down there in the dark at the bottom of a lake that has kept them more completely than any cemetery ever could. If the Three Sisters disappeared tomorrow, the Great Lakes would still be there, still enormous, still cold, still capable of killing you in ways that have nothing to do with rogue wave sequences. But something in the character of the place would shift. The particular dread that a November sky over Lake Superior produces in people who know the lake, that low gray specific anxiety, is not just about weather. It is about knowing that the water beneath you has a history of doing something sudden and irreversible, and that the warning when it comes will not come far enough in advance to matter. That knowledge changes how you stand at the shore. And some things are only beautiful because they are also dangerous. So here is the part where the whole thought experiment turns on itself. We've spent the last several minutes imagining a world where the Three Sisters don't exist and found that world to be in its own way worse. But there's a reason we framed it as a thought experiment rather than a prediction. Because the actual direction of travel is not toward less, it's toward more. According to data tracked by Great Lakes now, average wind speeds over Lake Superior have been increasing by roughly 5% per decade since 1980. That might not sound like much. 5% is the kind of number that gets buried in a footnote. But in wave physics, small increases in wind speed produce disproportionately large increases in wave height. Energy scales with the square of wind speed, which means a 10% increase in wind produces not 10% bigger waves, but waves that are significantly larger and carry far more destructive force. The warming of the lake itself compounds this. Lake Superior has warmed faster than the surrounding air temperatures. Its summer surface temperature rose by 4.8 degrees Fahrenheit between 1979 and 2023, the steepest increase of any of the 5 Great Lakes. Warmer water evaporates more readily, feeds more energy into storm systems, forming over the lake, and produces more intense and more frequent severe weather events. The lake, in other words, is becoming a better engine for the conditions that create rogue waves, including the Three Sisters. And then there is the ice, or rather, the absence of it. We mentioned earlier that ice cover on the Great Lakes has declined by roughly 25% over the past 50 years. What that means in practical terms for wave formation is significant ice acts as a lid on the lake surface, damping wave growth and limiting fetch during the winter months. Remove that lid and gale-force winter winds now have an open water surface to work with for weeks or months longer than they did in previous decades. Longer fetch, stronger winds, warmer water feeding more energy into storms. These 3 variables working together are not producing a calmer lake. They are producing a lake that is measurably more capable of generating the wave sequences we've been discussing. The Three Sisters are not fading into history as technology advances. They are being handed better conditions to work with than they have had at any point in the recorded era of Great Lakes navigation. On October 24, 2017, a buoy near Granite Island off the northern shore of Lake Superior, near Marquette, Michigan, recorded a wave of 28.8 feet, the largest ever measured by instruments on the lake. It was a short period wave, meaning the interval between crests was under 10 seconds. A 29-foot wave with a 10-second period is not just large, it is steep. And steep waves exert a different and more violent kind of force on a hull than long rolling swells of equivalent height. The storm that produced it underwent bombogenesis, a rapid pressure drop that causes a storm to intensify explosively, sometimes within hours. That mechanism, bombogenesis, is the same one believed to have driven the conditions that sank the Edmund Fitzgerald in 1975. The storm of 2017 was, in structural terms, a close relative of the storm that took 29 lives 42 years earlier. and it was not a once-in-a-century event. In the 8 years prior to this recording, Lake Superior has experienced 3 separate storm events that, according to historical probability models, should each occur only once every 500 to 1,000 years. 3 of them in 8 years. The statistical models haven't caught up with the reality yet. When a phenomenon that was supposed to happen once in a millennium happens 3 times in a decade, it means the baseline assumptions about what is normal on this lake are out of date. The Great Lakes that navigators, engineers, and regulators have been planning around no longer quite exists. What exists now is something slightly, and in some ways, significantly more dangerous. Gone. The geographic spread of the phenomenon is also shifting. Rogue wave events on Lake Superior are no longer confined to open water far from shore. Researchers at the Apostle Islands have documented groups of waves more than double the surrounding significant wave height occurring in near-shore zones, exactly where recreational kayakers, small boat operators, and shoreline visitors tend to underestimate the risk. The 3 sisters are moving closer to people who have never heard of them in conditions that don't look dangerous until they are. Charts. Modern ships carry GPS satellite weather feeds and hull stress monitoring systems that Dennis Hale's ship didn't have in 1966 and the Fitzgerald didn't have in 1975. That matters. It has almost certainly prevented deaths that would otherwise have occurred. But the physics of wave resonance and metal fatigue don't update their software. When the variables align, fetch wind speed, wave frequency, vessel length, the trap still closes. It closes faster now, in more places, more often. And the Great Lakes, which have always been underestimated by people who see the word lake and picture something manageable, are becoming less forgiving with each decade that passes. We started this story with Dennis Hale going to sleep, and we should end it with him waking up not on the Morel, but years later in a life he spent a long time trying to make sense of. He didn't speak publicly about what happened for nearly 2 decades. Not because he'd forgotten. No one forgets 38 hours on a raft in November with 3 dying men, but because some things take time to carry without breaking under the weight of them. When he finally did speak, first publicly in 1982 and then in the book, he eventually wrote what he said about his crewmates was not what you might expect from a man who had watched them die one by one. He said he missed them. He said he loved them. And he said he was glad for the time they'd had together. That's not the language of someone who survived a wave pattern. That's the language of someone who lost a family and had to figure out how to live with what was left. Sure, the 3 sisters are not a mystery waiting to be solved. Science has confirmed they're real, and the physics of how they form is well understood. What they are is a reminder that the Great Lakes operate on their own terms, that those terms have been killing people for as long as people have been on the water, and that the lakes are not becoming more accommodating with time. They are rewriting their own rules, and the new draft is harder than the old one. Yachts. Dennis Hale died in September 2015 at 75, having spent the last decades of his life making sure the names of his 28 crewmates were not forgotten. The lake kept most of them. It still does. And somewhere out there on Lake Superior right now on some November afternoon, when the sky goes gray and the fetch opens up and the wind finds its angle, 3 waves are forming in sequence the way they always have, the way they always will. Thank you for watching One Wave Away.